Now we're continuing with our programme, which is the Peter Golden Commemoration in Macroom 1994. You'll notice the many changes in the places and in the people over those years. So I hope you'll enjoy that programme now for the rest of the evening. The ceremony to commemorate Peter Golden, poet, patriot, orator and writer, was held in Macroom on Sunday the 19th of June 1994. This event, organised by the Peter Golden Plaque Commemoration Committee, consisted of the erection and unveiling of a plaque on a house adjacent to his birthplace at Masseytown, and later in the evening the holding of a reception at the Hooded Cloak, where the poetry, songs and life of Peter Golden were presented to a large attendance. The ceremony commenced with an assembly at the Castle Street end of the old bridge, a bridge of which Peter Golden once wrote, "On the old bridge's battlement long would I stay, till the skylark betoken the coming of dawn, and ascending on high I look down on my way, for a last long farewell to my lovely Ceylon." The special guests present on the occasion included Terence Golden, son of Peter and grandson of Terence Golden, who once had a classical school at Masseytown. Also Etna and Deirdre, twin daughters of Peter, who was married to an actress, Helen Leon Merriam. The three members of the Golden family now reside in the United States and came especially to Macroom to be present for this event. Also present were Mr. and Mrs. Rory Brewer, both of whom are very close friends of the Golden family. Here Terence Golden stands alongside Rory Brewer, just as Peter Golden stood beside Rory's father, Cathal Brewer, in the United States. The gathering to mark this special occasion consists of representatives from Macroom, Clondrohid, Ballinagree, Clonagluck, Rylan, Dunamore, and of course the husbands and wives of the members of the Golden family from California, Colorado, and New York. An extract from the life of Peter Golden, written by Jim Herlihy, reads as follows. Peter Golden was born on the 15th of August 1877 at number 14 Masseytown, Macroom. He was the son of Terence and Honora Golden. His father Terence was a classical teacher in his own school in Masseytown, and had such illustrious scholars as Antahar Padar O'Leary, Thomas C. Murray, Herbert Honohan, and Most Reverend Dr. Daniel Colan, Bishop of Cork. Following the death of his mother, Peter was fostered by Mrs. Nancy Corcoran of Flagmount, Rylan. Here Peter attended Knocknagown Rylan National School until 1894. Leaving the school, he went to work on the Gleeson farm, where he spent much time in the company of his cousin, Johnny Tom Gleeson, the renowned author of the song The Bowl Teddy Quill. His time spent on the farm influenced Peter to write A Dream of Country Life and The Glen Revisited. To gaze enraptured once again along the memory-haunted glen, and view with joy ineffable the more than lovely scene. In 1901, Peter, at the age of 24 years, departed on the emigrant ship to follow his sisters Mary, Helen and Catherine, as well as his brother John, to St. Louis, Missouri.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the... Thank you. Thank you, John. On behalf of the Peter Golden Committee in Macroom, I would like to welcome you all here this evening. Now, this evening we are honouring a man whose honouring is long overdue. He was, in our book, one of the greatest patriots that ever left Ireland. Now, I am not going to go into detail here tonight because I have so many speakers that are familiar with his work. And first of all, I'll introduce you to a man who started the whole movement and put it into place, and that is Jim Herlihy from Ballincollig. Now, Jim, whose people came from Rylan, The story I'm told by Paddy Mahoney of Glownagluck is that Jim came to Glownagluck to trace his relationships and piece together the family tree, which Jim is very good at. And he was interested in doing a thesis on Johnny Tom Gleeson, the famous poet who wrote Bold Teddy Quill. And Paddy Mahoney said to him, why not write about Peter Golden? And that's just what Jim did. Now, the amount of work that this man has done in the research into Peter Golden is fantastic. And later in this year, we hope that we'll be back with Jim in launching a booklet on the life of Peter Golden. Now, I'm not going, as I said, to go into details on Peter Golden. I let it to Jim Herlihy to kick off with Peter Golden. Jim.
Mr. Chairman, Reverend Father, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Today is a day of celebration at the birthplace of the poet, patriot and orator, Peter Golden. We celebrate and recognise Peter's achievements both at home and abroad, here in Macroom and the surrounding areas in the shadow of the Bogra Hills, of Anaganahy, Glownagluck, where he was reared, of Knocknagown, Ladan, where he spent his school days, and Dunamore, the birthplace of his mother, Honora McCarthy, who died when he was but 15 days old. We remember Nancy Corcoran, who reared Peter after the death of his father, Terence Golden, on the 23rd of July 1885, who taught Latin and Greek in a school in Massytown, and whose untimely death occurred when Peter was only in his 8th year. The school run by Terence was the alma mater of such distinguished scholars as Antahar Padro Lera, Thomas C. Murray, the renowned Abbey playwright and dramatist, Most Reverend Dr. Daniel J. Coughlin, the former Bishop of Cork, Very Reverend Canon Brew of Dunamore, and Mr. Herbert Hounahan, the former Assistant Editor of the Irish Independent. Peter Golden was born on the 16th of August 1877 at Massytown, Macroom, County Cork, in the house just behind us. He was the youngest in a family of 7, consisting of 3 boys and 4 girls. One of his brothers died at childbirth, and his sister Johanna only survived for 2 weeks. The family resided at Massytown in a small house, the remains of which can still be identified at the rear of the residence of Mr. Cornelius O'Riordan at house number 14 in Massytown. Peter's grandfather John, who was around from 1801 to 1889, was a native of the townland of Inchillea in the parish of Ahina. And here he leased 44 acres from the Reverend James Gollock in the mid-1850s. John, whose ancestors came from nearby Goran, Dunamore, married Catherine McSweeney, who was alive from 1804 to 1880, a native of Castlemore in the parish of Kilmurray. Catherine's grandnephew was Terence McSweeney, the martyred Lord Mayor of Cork and second cousin of Peter Golden. An aunt of Peter, Mary Golden, married Johnny Tom Gleeson, a native of Glownagluck, South Rylan. They had a son, Johnny Tom Gleeson, a renowned balladeer and noted composer of the song Bold Teddy Quill. In September 1894, young Peter Golden left school and went to work on the Gleeson farm. Here he spent many lean but happy days in the shadow of the Bogra Hills. Peter joined his brothers and sisters who had settled in St. Louis, Missouri in 1901. He was 24 years of age. Peter entered the St. Louis School of Elocution and Dramatic Art and graduated on the 8th of June 1903. The following year, his first book of poetry, entitled A Voice Crying in the Wilderness, was published. 2 years later, on the 21st of September, the Circuit Court of the city granted his certificate of naturalization, and he became a citizen of the United States of America. He was still very mindful of all that was happening in Ireland, and his sentiment to the Irish cause was very strong. Each week he sold 50 copies of the United Irishman, and later an equal number of the publication entitled Sinn Féin. The vagueness that existed in understanding the situation in Ireland by many of those to whom he distributed the papers was expressed in the comment from one of his customers, who remarked that fellow Griffith should not be stirring up trouble over there. Peter Golden established the first Sinn Féin Society in the United States in St. Louis. With some close associates, he published a newspaper entitled Irish News, and this was launched on the 19th of January 1908, with Peter as its editor. Peter had the ability to express himself through song and verse. On Friday, 13th of November 1908, he was featured giving an illustrated trip through Ireland, which included a selection of songs, legend and poetry from his native sod. The supporting group for the evening were the Sweet Irish Singers, who included his sister Mary. The songs featured were The Bells of Shandon, The Lass from the County Mayo, The Old Plate Shawl and Killarney. An acting career was pursued by Peter, toured extensively with the Ben Greet Players, the Clifford Devereux Company, and the Southern and Marlowe Company. He received rave reviews for his performance as the gallant Sebastian in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night at the Dallas Opera House. By the year 1913, Peter had now moved to New York and he resided at 165 William Street. His career on stage was further advanced as a member of the Irish Theatre of America on Broadway, which was under the directorship of Whitford Kane and John P. Campbell, the latter playing the role of an old man in both plays, and the performances were held at the Bandbox Theatre, 293 East 57th Street, New York, during the 1915-16 season. During this time in the theatre, Peter met Helen Leon Merriam. They were appearing together in Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors. Helen was an actress, an ardent feminist, and the daughter of Charles Collins Merriam and Florence Lyon. The Merriams and Lyons were both old New York State families, and two of Helen's ancestors had fought in the American Revolution. An uncle, C. Hart Merriam, was a leading naturalist and founder of the United States Biological Survey, now the Fish and Wildlife Service of the Department of Agriculture, which he directed from 1885 to 1910. He was also one of the first founders of the National Geographic Society, which publishes the National Geographic magazine. His sister, Florence Merriam Bailey, was an acclaimed ornithologist, and she was the first woman to be made a Fellow of the American Ornithologist Union and had a number of books to her credit. Their father, Clinton L. Merriam, served 2 terms as congressman in the United States House of Representatives. Peter and Helen were married in 1916. On the 4th of December 1917, their son Terence was born. On the 22nd of June 1919, twin daughters, Deirdre and Etna, came into the world. Peter often referred to his children as Bobbin and the twins. For some reason, he was called Deirdre Dido, or Dido Dumpling, perhaps at the time because she was a little plumper than Etna and used to roll along the floor from one end of the apartment to the other, much to the amusement of Peter. Etna was sometimes called Wee Was, and Peter wrote a ditty of the same title which he used to sing to the melody and rhyme of Pop Goes the Weasel. On the 10th of October 1914, a letter was received by Miss McKenna from Padraig Pearse, who was at that time in St Enda's College and at Farnham in Dublin. The contents of the letter included the following sentence: "I am glad that Peter Golden is over there with you." It is obvious that Peter was well known to Padraig Pearse, and following the Easter Rising of 1916 in Dublin, Peter's activities on behalf of the Republican movement in the United States increased dramatically, and he revelled in the tasks to which he was assigned. Peter was a journalist with the Gaelic American newspaper under John Devoy. He was a founder member of the Friends of Irish Freedom, New York Secretary of the Irish Progressive League, and National Secretary of the American Association for the Recognition of the Irish Republic. The War of Independence, the tragic death of his cousin Terence McSweeney, followed by the Civil War in Ireland, left Peter devastated. On hearing of the outbreak of the Civil War, on the 1st of October 1922, Peter landed in Ireland. He visited his boyhood homes of Macroom, Dunamore and Rylan. In fact, he was in Macroom the day that Michael Collins was shot. He wrote a tribute to Harry Boland in the Cork Examiner. He was arrested and later released by General Emmett Dalton. He is recognised as making frantic efforts to reconcile both sides. He met De Valera in Ballyvourney, Erskine Childers in Cork, and Liam Lynch in Fermoy. He also travelled to Limerick and Dublin and recorded a diary of events capturing the mood, the fears and the aspirations of the Irish people at such a critical time, which were published in his book Impressions of Ireland in New York in 1923. The intensive pace of Peter's lecture tours took its toll on his health. He was advised to travel to California to improve his health. And on the 18th of March 1926, Peter Golden boarded a train for Pasadena, California, but he was taken ill near Denver, Colorado. He was removed from the train to the Albany Hotel, Denver, where he was treated by a Dr. O'Connor. His condition deteriorated, and he was then moved to the Mercy Hospital in the city. He was given the last rites by Father Brady, and his sad demise came on the 19th of March 1926, the feast of St. Joseph. His luggage, as might have been expected, contained over 40 books. Like Terence, his father, books were an important part of Peter Golden's life, and the prospect of being away in California for some time meant that he intended going well prepared to do some reading. His literary flair had been sacrificed due to his political involvements, and the cause for which he dedicated his entire life demanded all and gave nothing in return. In all, he published over 85 poems. The majority of those involved never understood fully the great ideals of the few. Golden was beyond reproach and totally honest in his extreme dedication to the freedom of his native country. He obtained very little in terms of remuneration and gave all of his time and, in the end, his life in return. His loss to the Irish cause was immeasurable in terms of his financial and vocal support. The funds raised by him were sent back to Ireland in between the covers of a missile-sized book. The $100 bills were packed tightly and posted to James O'Mahony in Ladan, who in turn passed the unopened package to Mary McSweeney for further distribution. The large sum arrived faithfully at Ladan every 2 months in support of the cause. A letter received by his wife Helen from Sister Angela Brennan, a daughter of the youngest Young Ireland leader, read, "You have cause to grieve, but you have another great cause to rejoice. What a heritage he has left you all. Some big patriot asked me, did Peter Golden have any children? These children will be well worth bringing up." On the 20th of March 1926, Peter Golden's remains lay in state in the funeral home of W.P. Horne and Company, Cleveland Place, Denver. A mass and a memorial service was held in Denver Cathedral, and on the 22nd of March his remains were removed to the Church of the Argon, New York, and laid to rest in the adjoining cemetery. The New York Board of the American Association for the Recognition of the Irish Republic decided on the 29th of March to set up the Peter Golden Memorial Fund. The fund had 3 aims: to refund all expenses incurred in the removal of his remains from Denver to New York, to have his remains removed and interred in Ireland, and to place the remainder of the funds in a trust for the education of his children. Peter Golden's casket was placed on board the ship Republic, draped in the Irish tricolour and the American Stars and Stripes, and accompanied by Peter McSweeney to Ireland, Terence's brother. It arrived back into Queenstown Cove on the 15th of July 1926. As the casket was being transferred from the ship, the spectators sang "Wrap the Green Flag Round Me, Boys," and tears were shed by those on the quay who understood the significance of this sad homecoming of a true patriot. The following day, Peter Golden found his final resting place in St. Finbar Cemetery in Cork, his grave lying adjacent to his second cousin, Terence McSweeney. Both, in their own individual way, had sacrificed their lives for their country. Helen Golden and the children, Edna, Deirdre and Terence, were unable to attend. However, they relied upon a pen-picture account written and sent by Miss Annie O'Reilly from Massytown, Macroom, who described his homecoming. We join the people of all the places I've mentioned, by whose large attendance here today, on Father's Day, is indicative of the esteem in which Peter Golden is still held. I too welcome Peter's twin daughters, Edna, who has travelled from New York, Deirdre and her husband Paul Katz from California, and Peter's son Terence and his wife Sue Ellen from Colorado Springs. I wish to welcome Terence McSweeney's daughter Maura, cousin and lifelong friend of the Golden family, and her husband Rory Brewer. I thank them for their attendance. I wish to thank Paddy O'Mahony from Glonaglock, Ladan, whose father James Manny was a lifelong friend of Peter Golden. Paddy Crowley, Ladan, for his recollections of Peter. Norrie Barrett, whose grandmother reared Peter Golden. And Barry O'Brien, who jointly edited the manuscript with Edna Golden and the entire Peter Golden Commemoration Committee under the chairmanship of Pat Kelleher for their Trojan support. Finally, I also wish to pay a tribute to my late father, Michael Herlihy, a tailor from Knocknagown and a classmate of Peter Golden's, who introduced me to the Peter Golden story. To the late Dennis McSweeney from Ballinagree, who had a vast knowledge of the writings of Peter Golden, and the late Paddy Hubbard from Inchilea, who remembered Peter as he traversed from Ryland to Macroom, always carrying books under his arm. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Jim. And I now call upon Terence Golden to unveil the plaque. I'd move out of your way.
Where do you want me to get the card? The card there?
Here it is. Give him that.
No, this is your.
That's all I do.
Yeah.
You can get photographed by your...
Right.
Let's see the... Oh, isn't that beautiful? Oh, Padre O'Boyne. Oh, Ugo, Padre O'Boyne. Oh, isn't that beautiful? Oh.
Not nice now.
Isn't that nice now?
Well,
You want to sit down? No.
I'm just so touched. And so overcome and so pleased by this wonderful reception.
Great.
Now we have Etta Golden.
Wel een geet dolces, bewaile marog of Willemid aan of weer fad, die of geleer arsoekten mee de rinjeschiv in honor door naher en meed ebre wie deente agov geleer. I'm very I can't tell you how grateful we all are for all that you have done to honor our father. And I would just like to say a few words about how I came to Macroom the first time and met all you lovely people. I came over in '59, and first I was in Dublin, and I met Morda Og, Maxwini Brewer, and Rory Brewer, and we've been fast friends ever since. We went to a trip to Czechoslovakia 3 years ago and laughed our way through all the problems that we ran into, but that's another story. Then I came down here and I wondered if there would be any relations left. I didn't think there were, so I was just going to sort of pass through Macroom. First I stopped at the cemetery in Cork, and I laboriously copied out what was written on the stone and on my father's grave. And I didn't know a word of Irish at the time, but when I got here, in those days you didn't have to make reservations anywhere, so I just saw a hotel called the Terence Hotel. Now it's the Victoria Hotel. And since my brother's name is Terence, I thought I'd stay there. And I went in, and I think I saw two men talking Irish at a table nearby, so I ventured to ask them if they could tell me what what I had written down. And one of them, they were both foresters, and one was from away somewhere, but the other was Bill Shine, who lived here for many, many years. I'm very disappointed to learn that he died recently. He is now Erhlí na Firinne on the road of truth, but I believe that his son is here today, Liam Shine, and I met his wife, Mary, a few years ago, but she unfortunately couldn't be here tonight. Well, Bill Shine said to me, well, your father must have been quite somebody to be buried in the Republican plot. He said, not everybody gets buried in the Republican plot. So then he said that maybe the owner of the hotel, Mrs. McCarthy, could tell me something about whether there were any relations here or not. And her daughter, Maura McCarthy, I don't know whether she's here or not. I hope that she's been able to come. And so Mrs. McCarthy told me where to go, and Bill Shine took me down there, and it was to the house where Julia O'Callaghan, Julia O'Callaghan, yes, she was Nancy Corcoran's daughter, and she was the mother of Norrie and Dennis and all the rest of the family, and Bill Shine took me down there, and when Julia O'Callaghan came to the door, her name was Julia, in case I said it wrong, she came to the door, and she asked who I was, looked very puzzled, and who was this Yank appearing at the door, and I said that I was a daughter of Peter Golden, and she said, "What are you to Peter Golden?" And I said, again, I was his daughter. So before she even had time to invite me into the house, she said, "He was like a brother to us. He was no stranger at all. He was the boss of the house. I was a fearful pet," she said. And then she invited me into the house and she told me all kinds of interesting stories about him. And then the next day, Norrie and I think it was Jackie that day, or maybe it was Paddy, I'm not sure, but I think it was Jackie because I think Paddy was working that day. That was Paddy Barrett. That was Norrie Barrett's wonderful husband. He was a beautiful man. He was a noble man, and I'm very sorry that he can't be here today. And we went up to Annaganahee, and we saw the ruins of the house where Father had been raised by Nancy Corcoran. And there was an old man there with a cap on, and he looked as though he had been buried in the peat for 30 years, in the turf, the colour of him and all. And I asked him if, he'd been dug up like an archaeologist or something. And I asked him if he remembered Peter Golden, and he said, "I do. I remember him singing O'Donnell a Boo," and this interested me because on the very last program that my father sang in New York, the last song on it was O'Donnell a Boo. And then one of the interesting stories I learned was from Richard Brown, who is a nephew of Norrie's, if I've got that straight, where his father had some of my father's poems, and when the Tans raided the town during the Tan War, he thrust these poems into an empty stout bottle so they wouldn't be found. And I think he still has those poems. I've seen them, and of course the pages are all brown from the stout. Let me see now. I don't want to fail to mention anything that I was going to mention, and I don't want to leave anybody out. There's so many that I don't think I can mention everybody. I don't want anybody to feel left out. But we're so grateful to all the people that we know on the committee. But we didn't meet everybody on the committee. Last night we met, of course, Pat Kelleher, who has been so instrumental in all of this, and Eugene O'Riordan, and Kevin Cotter, and now Christy Leahy, John Brown. They were not there last night, were they?
Later tonight.
Oh, yes. And then I haven't got the list of all of the others. Let's see if... Dennis, Norrie's brother. I only learned today that he was with Father, and he, a lad, 12 years old, when Father came in 1922, and Dennis took him over to see old Nancy Corcoran, who was still living at that time, and then Dennis was present 4 years later at the funeral in Cork, in St. Finbarr's. So he probably, if he were here tonight, he would be the only one who would have been there. And let me see if there was anything else I specifically wanted to mention. I'm so sorry that, as I say, that Dennis is not with us tonight. And there are others that I knew that I met here that in past years that are also Erslina Firinja now. And but I remember them all very, very warmly, and of course none of us will ever forget this night. I hope I haven't spoken for too long.
Thank you, Edna. I now call on Rory Brew, son of the famous Republican Cathal Brew. Today, Rory can be controversial at times, so thank you very much, Rory.
You can be controversial tonight if you want to.
It's the first time I've heard that. For a long time. Nach das éisteach dinner a tógach. A rugach agus a tógach an san stát éanta a tachtan so agus a Lord Gaelgelinge. It's agus sin rud ag na corúnar an nuair a cúil mé iad gléisiar am airning a hán timpeall blian go leithe hen agus dúirtí Díogad, chuna stán tú? Ó nu abrach. Gus nu bhís gon céhí an. Ceap mé gras beidir a ggóil na rud éigent. ein come ta ana hasaram agus ta man bhuic dutche etna agus de graféir agus de grahar trelach agus den cahirlach an sa agus an costa asach te curhortum tachtan sa agus a boalum ka ha me ra tresh rind olish all o etna agus o kudis na paperi so gurkig agus in san statente o rodi alamis I dev padro goli leg se koma son gur vasses fein de tuk din a lara skrier agus mai inam target a couple of this rodi Godanas sé mar go bhfuil siad simúl agus ní hesanúm dal siar méid a dúirt na rudaí simúla a dúirt Jim Hurley gédal siad fé mar a dúirt sé rugach padar ó ggólaí Macroom in Octave Shacht. I'll go on with a few points about Peter Golden in the language that we use most at the present time because they're very interesting. I found when I read about him and got some data from Etna and from some American and Irish papers about him that he was something of a unique figure. He was one of the many of those who had to leave our country, as many do today, and find a livelihood in the United States, who worked tirelessly over the years to convince American opinion of the correctness and the essential character of the Irish struggle for freedom. And Peter Golden was one of these people who started off as a youngster having left school. He was the son of a very distinguished individual, one who you might almost describe as one of the old head schoolmasters in the sense that he, having first met his wife-to-be when he was teaching in Donaghmore, set up a school of his own here in Macroom, not far from the castle, and proceeded to teach in the way that he thought was appropriate, which came from the olden days, and that was that amongst the subjects being taught were Latin and Greek, which was quite an unusual capacity to be able to project to youngsters. And he had, as Jim has mentioned to you, he had many distinguished pupils attended his school. Indeed, they were very fortunate to have a teacher like the late Terence Golden. However, Peter, in his own way, made his own contribution, and you can find even in Etna here and in his son Terence and his daughter, you can find this blend of idealism which his father possessed and his their grandfather. He was, for example, he was regarded as being, that's Peter's father, a thoroughly honest and impractical man. This is a kind of the best tribute I think that you can give to anybody, is to say that they have ideals, that they have principles, that there are things they're willing to work for, not for themselves, but because of the need to contribute to life. And that's one of the things that Peter Golden himself demonstrated in subsequent years when he was forced, after the early death of his mother, a few weeks after he was born, he and his sister were taken over by a local woman, God bless her, Mrs. Nancy Corcoran, who looked after the two boys, and the sisters were taken on in hand and looked after by a priest from the locality. And as I think Etna has mentioned, and Jim mentioned, that the daughters went to school in Belgium and curiously followed the tradition of those centuries ago, each one getting over to the States and then earning the money to bring the other over, one by one. And strangely enough, Peter himself, when he was working in the Irish cause in America, met his sisters, and indeed they took part in many song sessions he engaged in the United States at meetings on behalf of the Republican cause. Later on, after he got married, although his wife, Helen Lyon Marion, was an out-and-out American, complete no Irish extraction at all, she was an idealist, and she took up her husband's cause. And indeed, one of the interesting illustrations is that she took part in pickets and demonstrations, as he did right across the United States when things were dire here, to bring the attention of the American people to what was going on in this country. And one example of her is that there is a newspaper photo of her disguised as a longshoreman going on a ship to urge the crew to walk off and protest against the British for not allowing Archbishop Mannix to land in Ireland. This, for a non-Irish American, was really something, in my opinion. It's very clear from Peter's actions and activities from 1912 on that he was very deeply committed himself to the cause of Irish freedom. And he attended and spoke at many meetings, and as a trained actor, which he was, he became known as one of the best public speakers in America at that time. On the streets of Denver, in Chicago, in New York, he became known as the Titan of Macroom. Right across the USA, he was legendary, pleading for Ireland and for Irish liberty wherever he went. Una Ford, a correspondent there in the United States, speaking on behalf of journalists on the East Coast of Peter, who was also a journalist, said he covered most of the states and became probably the best known Irishman in America at the time. He won widespread liking and respect for himself personally and to a very high degree for his cause. He didn't, as Jim Fitzgerald said, he didn't visit Ireland, strangely enough, from the time he left until 1922, when he came back here to find out what was wrong and why the Civil War. Along with others, he kept on working for the ideal he believed in. Over the following years, he kept going until finally, on his way across the United States, worn out from his efforts, he became ill and died, as has been said, in Denver in 1926 at the very young age of 49. And later his remains were quite rightly transferred from the United States to St. Finbarr's Cemetery in Cork. We have here an example, somebody I would have loved to have known, who, as we would say in Irish, Bhí sé dílis dia agus dá tír gúchis, agus bí mis buchas dó as an séhar a thug sé dóine, gur mil maithagah.
Thank you, Rory. I now call on Nari Barrett, if she's in the audience, and Mrs. Rory Brewer to come forward to the platform, please. Go ahead. Mrs. Rory Brewer, please.
with this on behalf of the people.
Big hand there, please.
I'll see you again later.
Now we'll have the blessing of the plaque by Ken Ladan and Monsignor O'Connell.
Aguino. The other one is right. Aguino Ushla. I'm delighted to be here this evening when we honour a native son, a great poet, writer and patriot. And now we bless the plaque. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, may God, who is rich in mercy, and who has favoured us in wonderful ways, be with you all. Let us open our hearts in thanks to God for the favours showered upon us. St. Paul teaches us to give thanks to God the Father always through Christ, in whom he has given us everything. And that's what we are doing this evening. We're thanking God for this great man, Peter Golden. For when we became God's children in Christ, God gave us the riches of his grace, rescuing us from the powers of darkness and bringing us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. Whenever we acknowledge God's gifts, we prepare ourselves to take part more fully in the Eucharist, which is the sum of all blessings and the crown and source of all thanksgiving. So let us just, before we bless the plaque, listen to the words of St. Paul as he writes to the Philippians. Rejoice in the word always, in the Lord.